The orange falls into Miriam's hands before she even sees the tree. One moment she is pushing through a curtain of hanging vines, half blinded by the canyon's green shadow, and the next a ripe fruit drops straight from a branch overhead and lands warm and heavy in her palms, like the land itself is saying, "Welcome home." 3 weeks earlier, the lawyer in Cedar City had spread his hands apologetically across his desk and said their father's estate amounted to one thing only: a strip of canyon property outside Sandstone Crossing that nobody wanted. "It's rock and dust," he said, not unkindly. "You may find a structure, you may not." Rose had looked at Miriam. Miriam had looked at the deed. Some things only reveal their worth to the people willing to look. Their father, Edmund Hale, had never been a man of many words. Then he wrote letters home once a month, each one the same length, 2 pages, front and back, and the girls had grown up measuring his love by the careful evenness of his handwriting rather than what he actually said. He had worked as a land surveyor for 20 years, moving across the Utah and Arizona territories with his instruments and his mule, finding the edges of things, drawing the lines that told other men what belonged to whom. He had died in early March, quietly, from a lung complaint that gave him 3 weeks of warning and no more. Miriam had been working as a seamstress in Provo. Rose had been with their aunt in Salt Lake City, learning bookkeeping. They had both made it back in time to sit beside him, and he had held their hands and said very little, and then he was gone. The grief was not dramatic. It was the kind that settles in slowly, like dust after a wagon passes. You don't notice how much of it there is until you try to breathe. The property deed had come from the lawyer's envelope, along with a brief handwritten note in their father's level, precise hand. "This is what I have for you. Go see it before you decide anything." That was all. No explanation, no apology, no embellishment, just the instruction, offered with the same quiet faith he had given everything else. Miriam was the practical one. She had arranged the wagon, negotiated the hire of a patient older draft horse named Burl, packed their tools, their seed tins, their blankets and dried provisions, and calculated the 3-day drive south from Cedar City with the same composure she brought to everything. She was not going to cry about a worthless strip of canyon land. She was going to go look at it. Rose was younger and less guarded with her feelings. She cried twice on the first day of travel, and sang old hymns on the second morning, and by the third afternoon had gone quiet in the particular way that meant she was preparing herself for disappointment. The country around them had grown strange and beautiful and harsh in equal measure. Flat red tables of stone rising from the desert floor, dry arroyos cutting through pale sand, the sky so wide and so blue it looked painted. Sandstone Crossing was a small, sun-bleached settlement with a general store, a livery, a church, and about 40 residents who regarded the 2 young women and their loaded wagon with mild curiosity. The man at the livery stable, a broad-shouldered and weathered fellow named Walt Ober, had known their father by name. "Edmund Hale's girls," he said, and something shifted in his face that Miriam could not quite read. "You've come for the canyon land." "We have," Miriam said. Walt looked off toward the red mesa to the south and was quiet for a moment. "That strip's been in your father's name near 8 years. Folks here figured he'd sell it eventually. Nobody could figure what he was doing out there, riding in alone the way he did." He paused. Couldn't get him to say much about it. He said it without malice, but the words landed like small stones all the same. Their father had been keeping something. Miriam felt the shape of that fact settle in her chest and stay there. That evening they stayed at the one boarding house in Sandstone Crossing, a tidy place run by a widow named Mrs. Pell, who fed them bean soup and cornbread and asked questions with the practiced gentleness of someone who has learned to gather information without seeming to. "Your father's land," she said, refilling their cups with weak coffee. "The Coulter boys tried to buy it from him 4 years back. Offered good money, from what I heard. Edmund turned them down flat. Didn't give a reason." Rose looked at Miriam over her cup. "Why would anyone want it?" Rose asked. "Walt at the livery called it worthless." "Oh, the canyon itself is nothing to look at from the outside," Mrs. Pell said pleasantly. "Narrow entrance, sheer walls, not enough flat ground to run cattle, not enough open sky to farm in any serious way. The Coulter boys run the biggest cattle operation in this valley. They like land that can hold a herd." She shrugged. "Your father's strip couldn't do that. So to them, yes. Worthless." After Mrs. Pell had gone to her kitchen, the sisters sat in the small parlor in the lamplight, and Rose said what both of them were thinking. "What if it truly is nothing, Miriam? What if we've driven 3 days and we find a broken-down shack and a pile of rock and that's all there is?" Miriam turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "Then that's what we find." "Papa had nothing to leave us," Rose said, and her voice was careful and even, which meant she was working very hard not to let it break. "That's the truth of it. He spent his whole life walking other people's land and drawing their lines, and at the end of it, there's one strip of canyon that nobody wants." She looked at the dark window. "I don't want to feel angry at him. I don't want to." "Then don't," Miriam said quietly. "I don't know how not to." Miriam reached across and took her sister's hand. She held it for a long time without speaking, because there was nothing to say yet that would be true enough to matter. In the morning they would go and look. Whatever was there, they would look at it. That had to be enough for now. The canyon entrance was 3 miles south of town, where the red rock country folded in on itself in a way that looked, from the road, like a solid wall with no opening at all. But there was an opening, narrow, barely wide enough for the wagon if Miriam guided Burl carefully and Rose walked ahead, checking the clearance on each side. The walls rose on either side of them, 60 feet or more, smooth and deep red, still cool in the morning shadow. Rose stopped just inside the entrance and looked up. "Oh," she said softly. It was not nothing. Already it was not nothing. Miriam clicked her tongue to keep Burl walking. "Come on then." What their father had left them was not just land. They did not know this yet. They were still reading the canyon the way a stranger reads a face, surface first, looking for the obvious signs, missing everything that lives underneath. But as they moved deeper in and the walls curved, and the light changed, and the air shifted in a way that was distinctly cooler and carried a faint green smell that had no business being in desert country, something older than logic stirred in both of them. Edmund Hale had known something. He had always known. The first thing Miriam noticed was the walls. She had expected dry stone. Red rock, ah yes, that was everywhere in this country. But dry, cracked, the way desert stone always was, baking in its own heat. Instead, the walls of the canyon were dark with moisture in long vertical streaks, and she could see, even from the wagon seat, that the stone was permanently wet along those lines, the way a cliff face looks after rain. Except that it had not rained in weeks. She pulled Burl to a stop. "Rose." "I see it," Rose said from ahead. She had both hands pressed flat against the canyon wall, and when she lifted them away, her palms were damp. She looked at Miriam with an expression that sat exactly between confusion and the first early edge of something else. They left the wagon at a wide spot where the canyon floor broadened enough to let Burl stand comfortably, and they walked. The canyon curved. That was what the entrance had hidden. Not a short slot of rock that opened onto emptiness, but a long, winding passage that turned gently south and then east. And with each turn, the walls grew higher, and the air grew cooler, and the smell of green things grew stronger until it was unmistakable. Rose stopped walking. From somewhere ahead, not far, perhaps another 50 yards around the next curve, came a sound. Water. Not the imagined sound of water that a thirsty person in desert country sometimes conjures. Real water, steady and silver and impossible. The sound of a thin stream falling from height onto stone and then running somewhere below. They looked at each other. They walked faster. The canyon opened. It did not open wide. It was still a sheltered cleft in the rock, perhaps 80 feet across at its widest, surrounded on all sides by soaring red walls that curved upward and then leaned slightly inward overhead, so that the sky above was a long, bright stripe of blue, and the afternoon light entered at a slant and hit the far wall in a warm amber glow. But within that space, within those walls, there was a world that had no right to exist in the Utah Territory desert. Water ran down the east wall in 3 separate streams, thin as ribbons, finding ancient channels in the stone and following them in silver threads down to the canyon floor, where they collected in a shallow basin and then spread outward through a series of small carved channels. Cut stone, Miriam saw, not natural, to cut stone laid by someone's hands with care and intention. And those channels ran between the raised garden beds and the trees. The trees, orange trees, a dozen of them, perhaps more, heavy with ripe fruit in the afternoon light, their dark glossy leaves moving slightly in the air that flowed down from the waterfall. Beside them grew figs, their broad leaves making a deep shade. Along the base of the north wall, sheltered from direct sun, rows of kitchen herbs spread in neat beds, thyme and sage, and something Miriam didn't know by sight, but recognized by smell, sharp and bright and good. Flowers had seeded themselves into the cracks along the south wall, small and persistent, purple and pale yellow. Vines spilled down from ledges 20 feet overhead, long and trailing and green in a way that hurt to look at after 3 days of red desert. And at the far end of it all, pressed against the west wall in the deepest shade, sat the cabin. Stone, low and solid, built from the same red rock as the canyon itself, so that it looked almost grown from the place rather than built in it. A narrow door, 2 small windows, a roof of flat stone slabs laid with careful overlapping, and along the roofline a thin line of flowering moss had taken hold in the mortar. Miriam stood at the edge of it all and did not move for a very long time. Behind her, she heard Rose make a sound she had never heard her sister make before. Not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but something that lived exactly between the two. They did not speak for several minutes. There was too much to take in, and talking would have broken something that neither of them wanted to break yet. Instead, they walked slowly through the oasis, because that was what it was. There was no other word for it. And they touched things. Rose pressed her hand under one of the silver streamlets coming off the east wall and held it there while water ran over her knuckles and dripped from her fingers. Miriam crouched beside one of the stone irrigation channels and traced its edge with one finger, feeling the smoothness of it, the clean, precise line of the cut. Someone had made this. Someone had spent years making this. They went to the orange trees first. The fruit was heavy and ripe, and Rose pulled one from the nearest branch and held it in both hands for a moment before pressing it to her face and breathing in. She had not eaten a fresh orange since before their mother died 7 years ago. She stood under the tree with her eyes closed and breathed. Miriam walked the rows of garden beds. They were not wild, or not entirely. There was wildness at the edges, the way living things always push beyond the lines you draw for them. But the beds themselves had been shaped by hands, raised borders of flat stone, soil dark and rich with the continuous moisture from the channels. She could identify the sage and the thyme, and crouching close, she found rosemary and what she was almost certain was oregano. There were also vegetable beds, lying fallow now but clearly tended, the soil recently turned, the borders maintained, the channels clean of debris. He had been here recently, very recently. That thought stopped her completely. Their father had been here, doing this work, right up until the illness took him. He had made the 3-day drive from Cedar City and back, month after month, year after year, maintaining this place in secret, and not once in all his careful 2-page letters had he said a single word about it. Miriam sat down on the edge of a garden bed and pressed both hands flat on her knees and stared at the orange trees and breathed slowly until the tightness in her chest eased enough to allow thought. He had not told them because he wanted them to find it. That was the only explanation that held. He wanted them to walk in here the way they just had walked in, without expectation, without anyone else's description shaping what they saw, and find it with their own eyes. Go see it before you decide anything. Rose was at the cabin now, pushing open the narrow wooden door. It swung on its hinges without protest, oiled, recently oiled, and the two of them stepped inside. It was one room, small but proportioned with quiet care. A stone hearth along one wall, a narrow sleeping shelf built into the stone on either side, a rough-hewn table in the center, solid and level, and on the table, weighted down by a smooth river stone, was a folded piece of paper. Rose reached it first. She unfolded it and read it, and then she looked at Miriam, and whatever was on her face made Miriam cross the room in 3 steps. It was a letter. Their father's handwriting, the same even, careful hand, and it was 3 pages long. 3 pages, the longest thing he had ever written to them. It began, "My girls, by the time you read this, you will have already seen what I made, which means you already know more than I could have told you." Rose sat down on the sleeping shelf and held the letter in both hands and read. Miriam stood beside her and read over her shoulder. Outside, the 3 silver streams ran steadily down the canyon wall. The orange trees held their ripe fruit in the amber light. The soft sound of the water filled the stone room like a presence, steady and patient, and entirely without hurry, and their father's letter told them everything. 8 years earlier, surveying a water rights dispute 2 miles north, he had followed a subsurface moisture line by instinct and found the canyon. The water was fed by a natural spring high in the mesa above, reliable, year-round, extraordinary in this country. He had bought the land quietly for almost nothing, because the canyon's shape hid every sign of the water from the outside. Then he had worked it, alone, season by season, clearing, channeling, planting, building. "I wanted a place that would hold you," he had written. "I wanted to leave you something that couldn't be taken away by drought or price or another man's opinion." They spent their first night in the cabin and slept better than either of them had slept since before their father's illness. In the morning, they went back to Sandstone Crossing for their wagon and supplies, and when they returned to the canyon, they spent the rest of the week learning it the way you learn a new piece of music, slowly, section by section, until you begin to hear how all of it fits together. Miriam's practical mind set to work cataloging. The orange trees would produce 2 crops a year in this sheltered microclimate, probably 300 oranges per tree at peak season. The figs were already producing. The herb beds, properly cultivated, could supply every household in Sandstone Crossing several times over. The water from the spring was clean and steady. She calculated, revised, calculated again. The numbers were astonishing. Rose's instincts ran toward the land itself. She was the one who found the second fig tree hidden behind the large flowering vine on the south wall, and who discovered that what she'd taken for a pile of stored timber in one corner of the garden was actually a carefully arranged cold storage cache for root vegetables, built into a natural alcove in the rock where the temperature stayed consistently cool. Their father had thought of everything. But in the second week, trouble arrived with a polite knock on their wagon board. The Coulter brothers, Harlan and Dex, the men Mrs. Pell had mentioned, rode out to the canyon entrance on a Tuesday morning while Miriam was hauling a water bucket and Rose was on her knees in the herb garden. Harlan was the elder, perhaps 40, with a civil face and the particular brand of courtesy that powerful men in small territories adopt when they want something. "Miss Hale?" he said, removing his hat, addressing Miriam. "We heard Edmund's daughters had come down, thought we'd pay our respects." They had, in fact, paid their respects. They were polite men, genuinely so. And then Harlan had come to the point with the same civility. "We made your father an offer on this land 4 years back. We'd like to renew it at a better figure. You're 2 young women managing alone out here, and while we respect your position entirely, the canyon property isn't suited to anything the Coulter operation needs. We simply want the water rights that come attached to the deed. We'd give you enough to set yourselves up well in Salt Lake City, or wherever you intend to settle." Miriam kept her face neutral. "What figure did you have in mind?" He named it. It was, objectively, a fair sum of money. It was more money than she had seen in one conversation in her life. She looked at Rose. Rose was perfectly still, her garden gloves in her hands, a sprig of fresh rosemary caught in the fold of her apron. "We'd need to think on it," Miriam said. Harlan nodded pleasantly. "Of course. No urgency." He glanced past her toward the canyon entrance. He could see nothing from there, nothing at all, just the shadowed slot between 2 red walls, and put his hat back on. "Your father was a private man. Never did let us in to see the property. We always figured it was simply a matter of pride, not wanting to admit the land had come to nothing." He smiled, touched his hat brim, and rode away. Miriam stood in the entrance and watched him go and understood, with complete clarity, that they had no intention of returning his offer. The days that followed were full of work and quiet and something that felt, cautiously, carefully, like happiness. But the Coulter offer sat at the back of Miriam's mind like a stone she kept stepping around. It was not fear, exactly. The Coulters were not threatening men. They had been courteous, and they had not returned after that first visit. But she understood the logic of their interest now as clearly as she understood her father's letter. The water. The spring that fed this oasis was worth more in this dry country than any of the orange trees or fig beds or herbs, and if the deed to this property was ever challenged, or if the water rights could be peeled away from it by some legal mechanism she didn't fully understand, everything her father had built could be unmade. She took the deed and the water rights documentation to the lawyer in Cedar City on a Thursday. She drove the 3 days alone, leaving Rose at the canyon with Burl and the rifle and instructions to bar the cabin door at night, not because she truly feared anything would happen, but because the precaution settled her mind. The lawyer, a careful, methodical man named Abner Price, spread the documents across his desk and read them without speaking for a long time. Then he looked up. "Your father attached the water rights to the land deed in perpetuity," he said. "He had it done 8 years ago, properly filed, witnessed, and registered with the territory office. The spring above the mesa is legally inseparable from this property." He paused. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Hale. Whoever advised your father on this knew exactly what they were doing. It's not an easy attachment to contest." "Can it be contested at all?" "Not successfully," Price said, and allowed himself a small smile. "Your father was thorough." She drove back to Sandstone Crossing with the papers folded inside her coat and the particular feeling of a door being solidly closed and locked. But when she arrived at the canyon 2 days later and rode through the narrow entrance and came around the bend to find Rose sitting on a flat stone beside the largest orange tree with a book open in her lap and a half-eaten orange in her hand, she found that her relief was mixed with something she had not expected. On the third morning of the return drive, alone on the wagon seat in the early cool, she had allowed herself to feel the full weight of it. Not just the property and the water rights and the legal security, but the years of her father's quiet work. The decade of Saturdays and slow seasons he had given to this hidden place, alone, without witness, without credit. He had surveyed other men's lines his entire career, defining what belonged to whom, and in the end he had drawn one line for himself, small and hidden and entirely his own, and poured everything he had into it. She had spent a great many years thinking her father was a man defined by reserve, by absence. She understood now that she had confused privacy for emptiness and silence for having nothing to say. He had said everything. He had said it in orange trees and stone irrigation channels and a 3-page letter left under a river rock on a wooden table in a canyon that nobody else had ever bothered to open. When she finally rode back through the entrance and came around the bend and saw the oasis again, all its green and wet and amber and gold, she pressed both hands over her face for a moment and breathed until she could see clearly. She did not tell Rose any of this, not yet. She unsaddled Burl and gave him water and carried the papers into the cabin and sat alone at the table for a long time, looking at them. The legal question was resolved. The Coulters could not take the water. The land was theirs, and it was safe, and everything her father had intended to give them was, in fact, given. And yet she could not move, because here was the thing she had not let herself say aloud. Not to Rose, not to anyone. She had spent years feeling quietly abandoned, quietly forgotten, and she did not know what to do with the knowledge that she had been wrong. She sat at the table until the amber light faded from the west wall, and the canyon filled with its deep blue evening shadow, and the orange trees became dark shapes against the lighter dark of the sky. Rose came in from the garden eventually and said nothing at first, only washed her hands at the basin and set water on the fire for tea. She had always known when to leave Miriam to herself and when to simply be near, and tonight she chose near. When the tea was ready, she set a cup in front of her sister and sat across from her and waited. Miriam spread one hand flat on the table. "He knew us," she said finally. "That's what I keep coming back to. He knew exactly who we were and what we needed, and he spent 8 years building it for us in secret." Her voice was steady. "I thought, for a long time, I thought that his quietness meant we weren't at the front of his mind, that his work came first." Rose wrapped both hands around her cup I thought the same thing. And the whole time, Rose said softly. They sat with that for a while. The fire ticked. The water sounds from the canyon wall came through the open window, steady and patient, the way they always were. Miriam looked at her sister across the firelight. "We're going to stay," she said. It was not a question. Rose met her eyes. "I know. It will be hard work, real work, not just tending what he started. We'll need to learn things neither of us knows. We'll need tools and seed and probably help from town before we can make the herb sales work and—" "Miriam," Rose said gently. "Yes, I know. I know all of that." Rose smiled, and it reached her eyes fully for the first time in months. "I said I know." They stayed. It was not a simple staying. It was the kind that requires you to rebuild yourself around a new center, to renegotiate your understanding of where your life is headed and what it will look like, and who it will ask you to be. They had both come to the canyon carrying the weight of interrupted lives, Miriam's seamstress work in Provo, Rose's bookkeeping training in Salt Lake City, and choosing to remain meant putting those interrupted threads down and picking up entirely different ones. But the work itself was clarifying in a way that neither of them could have predicted. They spent the remainder of that first autumn expanding what their father had planted. Rose had a natural gift for the garden that neither of them had known about because there had never been a garden to discover it in. She learned the irrigation channels within 2 weeks, understanding by feel and observation how the water moved and where it paused, and what the beds needed in the dry heat of midday versus the cool of morning. She began a journal, precise, illustrated with small, careful sketches, documenting the behavior of each plant through the changing season, the way her father must have done in the early years when he was still learning the place. Miriam turned her organizational mind to the practical business of the oasis. She drove to Cedar City and bought 36 additional seedlings from a nursery. More herbs, 2 young pomegranate trees the nurseryman swore would thrive in canyon conditions, and a grape cutting she carried all the way back wrapped in damp cloth. She spoke to the proprietor of the general store in Sandstone Crossing and arranged a standing order for dried herbs, beginning small: rosemary, thyme, and sage, tied in bundles, sold by the dozen. The first batch sold out in a week. Mrs. Pell at the boarding house ordered twice the quantity for her kitchen. The church deacon's wife, who ran the town's small, informal medical practice, came herself to inquire about medicinal herbs and went away with lavender, calendula, and a cutting of the healing sage that had seeded itself prolifically along the north wall. And word moved through Sandstone Crossing, the way word always moves in small frontier towns, quietly and comprehensively. And by the end of November, there were people who knew that the Hale girls had something remarkable out in that canyon, though most of them had not yet seen it. Walt Ober from the livery came one morning in early December, hat in hand, and asked with genuine humility if they had need of a few days' work laid in before winter. He was, he explained, a capable mason when not occupied with horses, and the stone cabin had a section of north wall that would benefit from fresh mortar before the cold came in. And he worked for 3 days and refused payment, and on the last evening sat with them at the small table outside the cabin and drank the tea Rose pressed on him and looked around at the canyon walls with an expression of complete and uncomplicated wonder. Edmund never said a word, Walt said finally, shaking his head. Not one word, all those years riding in here by himself. That was our father, Miriam said, and she found, saying it, that it no longer came with the old complicated ache. It came with something cleaner, a recognition, a pride. He was a remarkable man, Walt said simply. Winter was gentler in the canyon than outside it. The walls held the heat, and the spring never slowed. And on the 3 mornings when frost came to the desert floor above, the oasis was merely cool and still and deep in its own particular quiet, and the herbs slept lightly, and the orange trees kept their leaves, and in the cold weeks Miriam and Rose sat by the fire at evenings, and read and sewed and talked in the way that sisters talk when they have finally arrived somewhere they intend to stay. Rose taught herself to preserve. She learned it from a handbook their father had left on the single small shelf above the sleeping platform. There were 6 books there, all practical, all annotated in his even handwriting. And by midwinter, she had a row of sealed jars along the cabin wall that contained orange marmalade, dried herbs in oil, fig preserves, and a spiced apple butter made from trading excess herbs to a farm family north of town, who had an apple surplus and no preserving knowledge. In February, a letter came from Harlan Coulter. It was courteous, brief, and the offer was substantially higher than the first. Miriam wrote back in equally courteous, equally brief terms. She thanked him for his ongoing interest and informed him that the property was not for sale at any figure. She put a copy of the letter in the file she was building alongside the deed and the water rights documentation and her father's 3-page letter, which she had folded into a clean envelope and kept in the inside pocket of her coat for months, until she understood that she no longer needed to carry it on her body because she had learned it by heart. Spring came to the canyon in a rush of new growth that Rose documented in her journal with escalating delight. The pomegranate trees put out their first hopeful leaves. The grape cutting rooted and sent out 2 tender tendrils along the south wall. The herb beds thickened, and the fig trees unfurled new growth, and the orange trees bloomed for the first time that year, while Miriam and Rose stood among them in the warm morning light and breathed in the scent of the blossoms, which was sweet and clean and entirely improbable in the red rock heart of the Utah Territory. Their father had given them an impossible place. They were going to make it more impossible still. On a morning in late April, Miriam stands at the canyon entrance and looks back. The walls glow red in the early light. The silver streamlets catch the sun and throw it in small moving flashes across the stone. The orange trees are heavy again, the second bloom already heavy on the branch. From inside the cabin comes the sound of Rose singing, an old hymn, and the same one she had sung on the second morning of the drive south, except now it is unhurried and full. Miriam thinks, he knew exactly what he was leaving us. She thinks, some things only give themselves to the people patient enough to walk all the way in. Then she turns and goes back through the gate of red stone, home,